Just to give a brief background, the center undertakes research on financial markets in the Indian context with global markets as the benchmark. So we facilitate research by IMA faculty, doctoral students working in finance, economics, business strategy, and related areas. The center organizes seminars, workshops, and conferences. We also engage with relevant regulatory authorities and with industry bodies and other stakeholders. The center hosts some interesting databases. An art price index for India has been launched in November. We host an agricultural land price index that was launched earlier this year. The center also hosts the Business Inflation Expectation Survey, which captures the inflation expectations of companies in India. So the BIES is widely used, including by policymakers at the central bank and the government as well. The center is organizing an international research conference on fintech in March 2023. I know that several of you have submitted papers and are otherwise engaged in the conference. With this brief introduction to the center, I hand it over to Professor Yellapulli Vasudevan to take over for the webinar today. Over to you, Vasu.
Thank you, Professor Sanket. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Tapas Mishra to our webinar series, and to give a brief history about introduction as such to Professor Mishra is Professor of Finance and Head of Banking and Finance at Southampton Business School, and he's a leading expert in big data analytics and high dimensional econometrics. His research actually has a wide range, I think, including green finance being one of them. And so he has published in Emerging Economics, Journal of Economics and Behavioral Organization, some of the top journals that we know in this field. And we are happy to have him, and we are happy to I'm happy that he is able to present the web. But one more thing about Professor Mishra, which I want to mention, is that he has been not just part of academics, but also part of like think tanks in his roles, multiple roles. And one of them includes the Institute of Future Studies in Sweden, and also International Institute of Applied Systems and Analysis, which is in Australia. With this, I hope I have done justice enough to sort of introduce Professor Mishra, who is multifaceted. So I hope all the participants here enjoy his presentation on the impact of bank mergers on corporate tax aggressiveness. With this, I hand over the virtual mic to you, Professor Mishra.
So I'll just mention one thing. I think I made an error. I mentioned Professor Tapas Mishra's PhD at University Catholic de Leuven. He is actually a faculty at Southampton University, and so that was something that was a bit of an error. So I welcome Professor Tapas Mishra to give the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Vasu and Sanket. It's wonderful to be here. It's an honor to present my work at the Mishra Center for Financial Markets and the Economy. As I mentioned before, on a humorous note, I am a Mishra too. So this my surprising affinity with the surname of the center, it's a mere coincidence. But I am as you mentioned rightly, I am an economist by training. But the research I'm presenting today, it concerns aspects of corporate finance and international business. In particular, the mergers of bank on corporate tax aggressiveness. So it is basically an economist's perspective of modeling the dynamic interdependence or dynamic interlinkages between the two, bank mergers and corporate tax aggressiveness. This looks like a multidisciplinary angle. I'm an economist, and Vasu, you rightly mentioned about I do research on high dimensional econometrics. So what is an economist doing here? I guess this is a multidisciplinary research, but this concerns the aspects of this corporate finance and international business, as I mentioned. But I think multidisciplinary research is actually very important because it embeds the dimensionality of our knowledge from many disciplines And that is becoming actually increasingly popular among academics in many institutions because they want to deliver impactful research, what they call. So that's why multidimensionality of research or multidisciplinary research is important. As for myself, I am actually deeply motivated to do this multidisciplinary research because I have been deeply motivated by none other than the famous scientist, Sir Jagdish Chandra Bose, who was a pre-independence era stalwart, who has multiple innovations to his name. And he actually started his career as a physicist. Then he moved on to becoming a great botanist and biologist. So when he had innovations on something called crystallograph, you might know about that, which shows that plants like human, they can also feel anxiety, pain, love, and fear. So he was the first one to show that plants can also feel exactly that. But see, being a physicist, he could do all these things. So when he was trying to establish the famous Bose-Einstein Institute, and in his presidential note, he actually mentioned that in the pursuit of my investigations, I was unconsciously led into the border regions of physics and physiology. So to my amazement, I found boundary lines vanishing and points of contact emerging. I think this message is universal and it helps us delve deep into connecting missing dots across various disciplines. So that is the reason I'm an economist, but I'm of course the head of banking and finance. So, but this research basically is from an interdisciplinary angle. So I hope you are until now not very much bored with my long introduction. The good thing is that I can only see some faces here. So, but I cannot see the faces of others, which is good. So I cannot really fathom the expressions, a frown or a smile. So jokes apart, let me get back to the business. So this is my plan. I hope the slide is moving. Yes. So this is the outline of my talk. So I will try to give you some of what motivated this type of research and will summarize the main results. We'll interlink the literature, giving some institutional background, describe the data architecture and empirical strategy. Then I will discuss about the main findings of the research. And finally, I will conclude by the contributions from this research. So what is the main motivation of this relationship between tax aggressiveness and bank mergers? Actually, the study of the dynamic implications of mergers in banking, in the banking context is actually not new. As far as I know, there is a large body of literature that shows that bank mergers actually can change the bank market structure and financial system through which actually information and resources are actually connected to various types of firms. One of the top papers published in the Journal of Financial Economics by Alan Gale. So they noted that one. Similarly, in an international business context, merger and acquisitions, as such we know, they occur for various reasons. And a number of theories are actually attached to the speed at which merger and acquisitions takes place. The speed of acquisitions or mergers and the organizational learning are actually the front-runner theories in this case. But it is commonly understood that irrespective of the theoretical viewpoints, why certain merger and acquisition takes place at certain speed, it is generally agreed that mergers or acquisitions impact in the merging firms or corporations' social and economic identities. Okay, so that is what the bank market structure and financial system I was talking about. They impact their social identities and their economic identities. So in this context, in the context of the banks, for instance, bank mergers can have a significant impact on bank loans, monitoring, loan contracts, and the borrower's welfare. So despite a growing body of literature on the subject, I think we have very limited understanding of whether and how bank mergers actually impact public borrowers' decision making. So in particular, one may ask whether the consolidation of banks can actually influence borrowing firms' activities. So in this context, we try to model and study the relationship between bank mergers and corporate tax aggressiveness. So I summarize here the main results. I will explain all those things in details later. So in the paper, we find that on average, we find a kind of significant and robust negative impact of bank mergers on the tax aggression of banks. On average, bank mergers actually find that reduce borrowing firms' tax shelter, especially a measure of tax aggressiveness, by approximately 4.9% compared to the mean value. A number of theoretical explanations can be given. For example, following mergers, banks actually focus increasingly on firms' hard information. And of course, they look for the financial transparency. So because of this requirement, this leads borrowers to incur actually high costs if they engage in tax aggressiveness, because this transparency makes manipulation more and more difficult. So this means if they are caught, these actions actually sends negative signal to the market, which means that subsequent loans, if they want to incur, that might become extremely very much expensive. So that's why bank mergers actually can lead to greater monitoring based on hard information. So there is a stronger negative impact on the banks. So our work involves an unbalanced panel data of approximately 25,945 deals from 383 lead banks and 5,982 borrowers in the US between 1990 and 2017. So we use these bank mergers as an exogenous source. And for this reason, we use a variety of estimation procedures, including the difference in difference mechanism, then matching methods, whether using the quantile matching processes, etc., and a number of placebo tests. A common confusion that occurs in the literature that to distinguish between tax avoidance and tax aggressiveness, because of course the tax avoidance is different from tax aggressiveness. But by construct, both the concepts are actually defined exactly on the same platform of predictive outcome and theoretical foundation. Whereas, for example, tax aggressiveness, it enables corporations or companies to enjoy the benefits of corporate citizenship without accepting the costs, which are then, these costs are then transferred to other parties. Even some authors suggest that this tax aggressiveness should be actually framed as a global sustainability problem, because it effectively erodes common social and environmental resources, right? But there are different perspectives on tax avoidance. Here, the tax avoidance, we think of that the pursuit of transactions and structures in order to reduce tax responsibility in a manner that is contrary to the policy or the spirit of government legislation. All right. So when we avoid tax, it might be beneficial to shareholders because it might increase up that tax cash. When tax avoidance is for the purpose of reducing the tax obligations, managers actually should be encouraged and compensated for participating in such transactions, right? And of course, tax avoidance causes, as we know, significant risk to the corporations, to firms. For example, the costs of additional taxes and penalties, that could be agency cost, that could be opaque information environment. A number of studies with the Balakrishnan, Desai, Dharmapala, in Journal of Finance, the JP, a number of studies they have found that how the tax avoidance can actually both benefit the shareholders and what type of risk and cost it can incur to the corporations. But there can be aggressive tax avoidance. So tax avoidance is illegal, regardless of the outcome or the motive that underlies the activity. So in contrast, that we know that tax aggressiveness is against, of course, the spirit of law and involves transactions with the business purpose that are only pursued for tax reasons. Some authors even suggest that tax avoidance falls on what they call a continuum from the perfectly legal to the outright illegal. So there is a continuum. So as such, as we know, the tax aggressiveness actually falls in a specific kind of gray area, although they're closer to be illegal and illegal end of the spectrum. In fact, I remember Milton Friedman in 1970, he mentioned, it was a famous quote. He used to say that a business is always business. Okay. And that the only social responsibility business has is actually to generate a profit, right? So for the benefits of the shareholders, provided it does so within the confines of the law. So whenever firms are aggressively pursuing tax avoidance, so they could be associated with a number of reasons: higher information asymmetry, lower earnings quality, with a paper by Balakrishnan. So there could be some trade-off between the marginal benefits against the marginal costs strategies in making tax avoidance decision. Am I audible? Do you have any questions at the moment? I saw that the internet connection was becoming a bit unstable. So if you cannot hear me, I can repeat again.
No, we just lost you for a minute, but it's fine, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
So whatever has gone into this black hole, it's all good. It cannot be recovered. Right. Anything that goes to the black hole, into the black hole, no speed, no light, nothing can escape the black hole, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
But here in this case, I'm not in the black hole. I can repeat again if you want me to.
No, I think we just lost you in the middle.
Right.
I think the flow was continued,
Okay.
so not much. Yeah.
So while I understand that fundamentally tax avoidance is principally against the spirit of law and thus closer to the illegal end of the spectrum, but tax avoidance certainly benefits the shareholders. Right? It is no doubt then that there are differing views on the true consequences of tax avoidance. So banks might be actually incentivized, as I said, to assist client with tax planning, so that the increase in after-tax cash flow can actually reduce the leverages, and they can provide potentials to enhance the firm's solvency and reduce firm's default probability. In an aggressive form, tax avoidance can actually engender significant risk and cost to the banks for several reasons, that they can increase the risk of being penalized by tax authorities, as I mentioned before. That could be, of course, it could be interlinked with a high stock price crash. There are good examples on that. Kim et al. In 2011, they studied to what extent this tax aggressiveness can actually lead to, or avoidance can lead to, a stock price crash. So there are a number of things, and of course, there is a less transparent environment when tax avoidance is being done. So that can lead to a number of things there. Right. So to continue with this one, finally, the role of banks in borrowers' tax avoidance here. Shareholders are prone to take higher risk, greater risk because of the limited liability, and stakeholders usually receive fixed future income and bear significant downside risk. So to summarize, stakeholders actually perceive the risk associated with the tax avoidance, and that could be salient than the benefit of tax savings. So these are basically the pros and cons of tax avoidance and aggressive tax avoidance, and of course the tax aggressiveness. Now, what are the potential impact of tax aggressiveness or impact of bank mergers on corporate tax sector? That is actually the main idea of the paper. But for example, merger and acquisitions, as I mentioned before, in any form, they actually impact on the identity of the merged firms. So it is also exactly the same. It is true for the banks as well. For example, bank mergers can lead to significant change in the organizational structure of the banks. They can actually lead to downsizing of branches, and of course impact information processing efficiency. So actually there is a large body of literature that exists on the subject. For example, DeFranco and co-authors in 2020 published a paper in the management science, and they investigated to the extent that bank mergers can lead to the identity and the structure of the organizational structure of the banks. Of course, we also know there is a depth of change in banks' monitoring quality of borrowers. For example, following mergers, banks actually need to heavily rely on hard information. For instance, among the hard information could be, say, audited financial statements, information related to corporate misconduct, etc. And these hard information can be quantified and it can be transmitted among various banks, management units in making lending decisions. Right. So now, does bank mergers affect actually a borrower's accounting practice? So that is basically a bit of accounting related problem. Yes, there is a good amount of evidence that suggests that changes in the bank structure, banking sector, and the associated bank monitor actually can triggered by mergers can manifest it. It's a timely loss of recognition, an increase in borrower's disclosure, etc. Further, we also see that when the financial transparency increases, firms can actually face higher opportunity cost of engaging tax aggressively. So this implies that borrowers may actually decrease tax aggressiveness when their lending banks actually engage in mergers and acquisitions. So coming back to the type of data and the methodology. So the data we have used here to construct our baseline sample, we first obtained the syndicated loan data from the Thomson Reuters deal scan from 1990 to 2017. So we know that this deal scan, they actually report two variables called lead arranger credit and lender loan for all lenders, right? So we follow previous studies and we designate as lead arrangers any lender for which actually the filed lead arranger credit is actually marked yes. If the value of the field is actually unavailable, which we have actually come across in a number of cases, then the lenders that act as an administrative agent, arranger, book runner, or lead arranger, lead bank, are actually they are classified as lead arrangers. So then we manually match all the bank names reported in the deal scan with bank legal names in the call report by using bank, city, and state information in both the databases. A lot of things have gone into the matching problem. It's a kind of hand-collected data. So a number of things have gone before we come up with this number of, say, total of 17,696 loan deals with 320 lead banks and 400 and 387 borrowers. And of course, we use tax aggressiveness and many other control variables from CompuStart. The details are all in the paper. I don't want to repeat them here. But the bank mergers data we collect from Securities Data Company, SDC. And we have used a number of controls to estimate the model, but let me just show you a simple econometric specification to understand the linkage between bank mergers and the corporate tax aggressiveness. So Y, in our case, represents the corporate tax aggressiveness measure for the borrowing firm, ith borrowing firm, and in syndicated loan contract, the bank J in year T. Then our main predictor variable is the merger I with J and T. Then we control for a number of variables with X, and for the definition of the Y for the tax aggressiveness, we primarily use shelter score as a measure of tax aggressiveness in our main estimation for the baseline estimation. And we also use a number of other measures, which again, this paper is all about different experimenting with a number of measures of tax aggressiveness, different controls, local conditions, etc. So among other measures, for example, we use book tax difference, adjusted book tax difference, discretionary, permanent book tax difference, etc., etc. But remember that this merger variable is a dummy variable, which is equal to 1 for all the year periods after the completion of the merger in which the bank, say J, is involved. We put 0 otherwise, Xi and X and IT that represent a vector of control variables. Of course, this is a kind of unbalanced panel data, and we used bank for fixed effects and year time damage. But
Mishra, just to intercept here, so can you give us a brief detail on what this tax shelter score is? How is it developed?
Of course, of course. Let me just go back here. Give me a second. Should be here. Because I just wanted to give you exactly the right definition for tax shelter. All right. Give me a second. All right, it is here. So tax shelter score, actually we have got it from Wilson's paper, which shows that one second, let me get back to the actual definition. Yes. So the way we have calculated is that we have run a regression of the sheltering, that variable, to how we have calculated this one. We have used a number of different variables called leverage, the size, and other things, and R&D, etc. And then we use the discretionary accruals from the performance adjusted book difference, and then cross-sectional Jones model. Leverage, we use the long-term leverage, and all these variables we run a regression and then find out from the regression, the dependent variable that is the shelter, which is recovered upon running a regression of these variables with discretionary accruals from the performance adjusted modified cross-sectional zones and long-term leverages, divided by total assets, and also use the size variable as the log of total assets, etc. So this is actually how we have measured shelter. And there are many other measures of course, we have used for the tax aggressiveness. In addition to the shelter is the adjusted book difference, and of course, a book difference and other things.
Well, yes. There's a question about what is the intuition behind this, as in like why tax shelter per se, but
yes,
let's say you want to.
So basically, I want.
Probably let me go back to the textbook definition of tax shelter.
Yes.
Which
yes,
is like a valuation that additionally that you would get if you were
yes,
valuation that is resulting out of tax benefits. That the fact that the question is that is it related to interest tax shelter or pure tax shelter, and that what is the intuition that is being captured with tax shelter?
Right. So this is actually the idea that you saw before, that when banks are merging, so during the period of merging, so because mergers can actually influence bank monetary system, and on a merged firm or a merged bank here in this case, so they will seek more of hard information and lot of transparency. So that means the borrowers, especially if a firm is borrowing from bank A, and that bank A is actually merging with bank B at some point of time. So during this time period, it is possible that they will seek more hard information and more of financial transparency from the firm. So that will create a kind of negative impact on the tax aggressiveness, because as we have seen, tax aggressiveness is in some form, it is bad, right? Ethically wrong, because they want to avoid for some form of tax to gain some financial gains. So this is the reason that whenever there is a merger happening, so it might invariably lead to a decrease in the tax aggressiveness, right? So this is the reason that whatever the measure of tax aggressiveness we take, whether the shelter or we take book tax difference or adjusted book tax difference or several other measures that I will show you in a minute. But the main idea is this: irrespective of the measures, so mergers will lead to a decrease in the tax aggression from the tax aggression from the banks. So, yes, please.
Yeah, maybe I can simplify what I'm trying to understand is that, see, you are saying that if the company were aggressive, which is possibly a dichotomous view in terms of taxation reduction, then it has its benefits. Yeah, so that is where the tax shelter probably as a valuation principle is coming in. So is it a reasonable measure, as in you want companies to, because this measure itself is intuitively assuming that only aggressive firms are going to benefit. If a non-aggressive, like ritualistic or let's say even more traditional firms are unlikely to have even a positive tax shelter. No, that is where I think the intuition is slightly being hardly.
Bashu, can you please repeat this one? Let me try.
No, so I'm saying that is tax shelter even positive for most firms? Is that something that one should expect?
Why we should expect positive the impact of mergers? Or...
No, not mergers, in general. Let's say if I have to measure without the average value of tax shelter for firms, is it going to be positive in general, or what do we expect? Because this seems like if at all there is an aggressiveness measure it might be reflected in probably your other variables somewhat, maybe. And
it is possible. It is possible. That's why we try to, as I will show you in a couple of minutes, that we do a number of placebo tests, and plus, because there could be some reverse causality issues that that might confound our inferences. So we have done a number of a host of robustness exercise, including different estimation procedures and matching and different definitions of tax aggressiveness. So we found exactly the same result, but we are driven by the theoretical implication from international business that whenever whether this is a bank or any kind of firms, when they merge, basically, especially whenever there is kind of hostile kind of a merger that happens, so it actually impacts the merged firms' organizational infrastructure. And they will certainly look for the, okay, you want bank A, you have lended to this firm I. So we certainly, because we need to comply for environmental and social governance and those type of this hard compliance structure we have to maintain. So that is the reason they need to have very hard information from them. And so that can actually, this means that whenever they ask for more of those things, so certainly that can be kind of, that will send a kind of negative sentiment, negative vibe to the firms that we will not engage more on the aggressive taxes, so that we can, in the long term, that will send a kind of negative signal to them. So that is the underlying theory.
Understood. One more related question.
Yeah.
Specification.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you're going to cover this eventually.
Of course.
But this merger variable takes the value of 1 for post period. So what I understand is what you're capturing is the total post period fixed effects, as in like average effect before and after the merger. But do you think that it would be worthwhile to also not just have just one variable, but instead, because let's say there is a merger and immediately the monitoring is not going to kick in. It will take time. So there will be like internal issues related to how the company is going to manage its HR problems, who is going to be hired, fired sometime. So instead of like having a single variable that captures the average effect completely, one might also expect that the monitoring goes down initially for the initial period after merger, and then it probably picks up again once the streamlining happens.
Okay. That's a good reflection, Bashu. In fact, I will show you again, there are a number in the paper, we have all the detailed results, but we have with some dynamics of the impact. For example, the bank merges today, the impacts are felt. For example, after a year, 2 years, or 3 years. So we have done a number of analysis in the paper by taking the plus or minus 3 or 4 years, or even 5 years upon the merging decisions are taken. So yes, there are some dynamics, not exactly in terms of panel data estimation, but reflecting on the idea that some decisions taken today that can impact the, say, tax sheltering or any other kind of thing in terms of the tax aggressiveness decisions, controlling for other variables, sometimes hence. So these, the lead and lag structure of the impacts have been covered. It's all in the paper, but then of course I will show you some results here. But that's a good reflection on that. Second thing is that about the variability, it is so what we have presented here in this equation, that shows a simple standard unbalanced panel data. It's a kind of regression equation of the panel data, but these impacts of say beta in this case, it's an average effect. So if the merger and acquisitions activities go up by say 1 unit, so for example, on average, what will be the impact on the tax aggressiveness? So we have also in the paper, we have examined the heterogeneity of the impacts of merger and acquisitions, of mergers of banks on the whole distribution or the entire distribution of the tax aggressiveness. So that means one can actually uncover a number of heterogeneous impacts of mergers on the distribution of tax aggressiveness. So for that reason, in one of our extensions following. Actually, this paper is under revise and resubmit. Now we have got a minor revision from the Journal of Corporate Finance. So following one of the reviewers' comments, so we have now extended our work to examine for the variability of impacts of merging decisions on the entire decision and entire distribution of the tax aggressiveness. Because it is quite possible that whenever there is a merging decision at some point of time, so the way it will impact the distribution of tax aggressiveness at the lower quantile could be different from at the higher quantile of the distribution. So that is why one may expect a heterogeneity in the impacts of estimate. That's why we have done, have performed what I call the unconditional panel quantile regression. The reason for this one, for the unconditional effects, as we know, are much more powerful than the conditional effects, and they are much more policy relevant than the conditional effects, conditional quantile or any kind of policy kind of setting. So unconditional regressions are quite good because especially in the panel context, it can actually model the fixed effects. So in a quantile regression, the fixed effects can cause a lot of problem. In fact, in the ordinary, even OLS kind of setting as well, fixed effects are not normally modeled. We use either time fixed effect, cross-sectional fixed effects, or just interact both of them and use them. But fixed effects are generally a very big problem. They are not modeled in a standard setting. But with the unconditional panel quantile estimation, the fixed effects are modeled. Even in the normal circumstance, we know there is some kind of high dimensional fixed effects estimation, where fixed effects are kept silent, so that the impact of the main predictors and other control variables are translated in a meaningful way. So there are a number of challenges to the estimation, but to be specific, yes, it's a kind of panel estimation. There could be issues on the reverse causality, the matching of the firms with the banks, and the impacts of distributional heterogeneity, etc., etc. So those things have been taken care of by using, say, for example, difference in difference estimation, then propensity score matching in a kind of OLS kind of environment, and a quantile matching process in a full distributional assumption. And of course, we have used this unconditional panel quantile regression to estimate the heterogeneous impacts of mergers on corporations' tax aggressiveness. So whether the mergers between lending banks, actually, they are likely to satisfy both the relevance and exclusion restriction conditions. Yes, following mergers, for example, bank monitoring, as we say, it's more hard, they are more hard information they will see, and they can actually place a big emphasis on borrowers' information environment and the extent of the quality of disclosure. So for that reason, bank mergers are very much likely to impact corporate tax aggressiveness. So as we know that banks normally offer loans to hundreds of firms, and then these merger decisions between lenders are therefore unlikely to be caused by factors which we think are related to specific borrowing of firms. There are some good examples from the literature of Chu in 2018 and 2019 in JFE and Journal of Finance. So I give you here the descriptive statistics to be just to be very brief here, because we need to discuss more about the main results. How much time do I have, Bashu?
I think typically you go on till 8 p.m. So it's like you have some 20. We can go on till.
Yeah, sure.
So 8-4, so 20 more minutes.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
So here we have put different measures of tax aggressiveness using the shelter and the book tax ratio and book tax differences, then adjusted book tax difference, and then the size, leverage, ROE, then R&D, etc., etc. So for the main measure of tax aggressiveness, we find that the mean and the median, okay, so mean is 2.074, median is 2.334, with a standard deviation of 2.449. So you can see the distribution is not really very much standard. So we can, the difference between the mean and the median with a standard deviation, high standard deviation. So they actually called for, that is why probably one of the reasons pointed out, one of the referees pointed out, that we should explore beyond this mean regression. So that is why this quantile-based estimation can give rise to, given that there is a very big standard deviation from the mean. So that means we can have an asymmetric impact of mergers on the distribution of the tax aggressiveness. Okay, but the values we have found here about the mean values of all these different measures of tax aggressiveness, shelter, MPTD or DD, PTD, etc. So they are actually consistent with what we actually find in the literature. For example, Hoy et al., Khan and Balakrishnan in 2019. So these ranges are falling within that. So for the characteristics of the borrowing firms in our sample, we find approximately 31% of the borrowers experienced bank mergers are there, and an average firm, we also find that a firm size of 7,000 and 7.339, a leverage of 32.6%, as well as return on equity, ROE, of say we have 20.8%, etc. So these are consistent from the standard literature. And we also find that there is an approximately 47.3% of the sampled borrowers who have a positive loss carry forward, and the average change in loss carry forward is approximately 0.01. So here I present here the main, the baseline result, and based on which we'll extend this framework to different scenarios, including different measures of the tax aggressiveness, different controls, different economic and local conditions, etc. So what we find here in this table, what we see that the results of the impact of the bank mergers on tax aggressiveness based on the equation that I presented here. So we are, yes.
Yeah, so this is where I think I still wanted to probably, I think, of course, the referees are more prominent in this. They want to look at the cross-section or quantiles. But my question is that, is there a possible time trend that is being captured by this variable instead of like the effect of mergers itself? So I would imagine that a firm, as it grows, it becomes more public, it becomes more bigger, it gets more monitoring, not just from banks on its own. It will probably start reducing its aggressiveness of taxation, right? Because once the firm becomes big, there is no need for it to engage in some sort of petty, risky businesses once it starts growing over time. So if the time trend is supposed to reduce the tax aggressiveness, how do you control for that in this regression setting is something I want to understand.
That's a very good reflection, Bashu. Yes, we have done so in an extent, because when we submitted this paper to the journal at that point of time, we did not control for this time trend. Obviously, it captures a number of dynamics through the trend. So in a later analysis, which is not currently in the paper that I sent to Sanket, so we did not have that one, but we have certainly done that. And in fact, it was one of the very nice comments from a referee who was really, so that's a very, very nice reflection. In fact, that's true. One reason why we did not use this time trend before, that we have an unbalanced panel data. And the fact is that different firms and banks, we do not have actually the same number of years. For some, we have, for example, 5 years of data. For some, we have 10. And so reflect, because whenever we use a kind of time trend, as we know, as an econometrician, if we have the same number of years in a balanced panel setting, it will capture a lot of nice dynamics over there. But although we have for some 5 years, for some 10 years, likewise, still the time trend for whichever number of years, it can still capture some dynamics for sure. But because we had different time dimension, and that was one of the reasons, because as a time series econometrician, sometimes I feel that if we don't have the sufficient number of time periods to form a kind of pattern of trend, then it is not good to use such a term in the estimation. Otherwise, it will confuse a number of other variables. If we use a time trend as a variable in the regression, we know it can capture a number of things, number of dynamics, and it can also confound the true impact of other variables as well. But still, since we have different time dimensions for different firms and banks, so we avoided at the first instance. But then we have added it later on. Of course, we could not extend the data, but especially because of the variations in the time span, but still we have captured some dynamics over here. But that's a very good reflection.
One suggestion though is like throwing a variable such as an age of the firm. Of course, there is a size of the firm, but size is not as clean an indication of reputation as much as ages. So you can just throw in a variable like age of the firm, which is like how long it has been listed, because I guess
we have a number of variables actually, including age, size.
Oh, age is there. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I think that sort of controls. I guess
we have number of them. In fact, this is a baseline regression, but then we have extended the baseline regression to many different other contexts. But yes, the age, the experience actually can matter a lot.
Yeah,
and that's a very yes. Of course, for example, if I know I have been in the business for so many years, and I know that by avoiding tax or by being aggressive, I still do not incur such a heavy loss. Because sometimes this age can actually reflect on the innovation of strategies. So if I have survived the competition, if I've survived it for so long, I know the system inside and out, and I know how I can actually be aggressive and can still remain in the system. So the age of the firm or age of the bank, that actually can matter. So that's a very good idea. Good. So what we find here, consistent with our hypothesis, that mergers should have negative impact on the tax aggressiveness. Yes, for different measures, we find that the estimates are negative. In fact, we have calculated relative to the mean that the percentage of the relative to the sample mean that the bank mergers actually can reduce borrowers' tax in different measures, D tax or shelter, by 10.3% and 5.1% respectively. How we have calculated, so the coefficients we have, and then we have correlated to the mean for each of the things, 2.07 something, then we just divide them. So that is how you get the.
Can you give us an idea on like what these numbers would be in terms of like actual dollars, as in like what is the tax reduction in terms of dollars? Or aggressiveness going down in terms of dollars?
Very good.
Something that is.
That's a very good thing. I have not yet figured that out, I should be honest, but it's a very good idea. When I was looking at those numbers of 4.9% or whatever number of things, so I was thinking that in terms of dollars, so what could be the actual magnitude? So some millions or something. I'm sure it should be something like that.
Yeah, I think that will make a larger impact in terms of like.
Yeah, I'm sure it could be translated for sure.
Yeah,
in that language it could be, but I have not figured that out yet. But it should be
Yeah, sure.
It should be pretty straightforward given the measure we have in
Measure,
terms of tax aggressiveness, the measure that we have here, whether the shelter or this book tax difference, etc. I'm sure it can be done that way. Right. So the choice of these variables we have in the baseline estimation basically follows from different research, different our existing research. So then we have tried to improve upon the baseline regressions to see whether the results are sensitive to changes in the local economic conditions, financial constraints, different measures of aggressiveness, etc. So then also we have done the matching the samples, because this is important, because we repeat this estimation for this question one you have already seen, consisting of what we call the both the treated and matched control firms. So because we are taking this merger as a kind of exogenous shock, so then we think that because of this shock, whether the treated and control firms, when we match them, whether they display exactly the same type of the expected kind of behavior. So this propensity score, as we all know, is then we actually the probability that we estimate from what we have done is kind of logic regression. Then we apply the nearest neighbor method. So to ascertain that firms with lender merger, what we call the treatment group, are actually sufficiently similar to their matched counterpart without lender merger, what we call the control group. Right. So for this, of course, we require the control firms to also have bank syndicated loans outstanding around the merger dates, but are not actually treated by the mergers of their banks. So in our system, each firm in the treatment group is actually matched to a firm. Actually, it's a kind of one-to-one matching with no replacement and no ties. So in the control group, that is from what we call this French 48 industry, and with the closest propensity score of 0.01, 1 year before the merger. So then what we have done from this matching process, we have arrived at finally 537 matched pairs from the definition of this tax aggressiveness with this term, the shelter, and 258 matched pair firms for other measures of tax aggressiveness, for example, book tax difference and adjusted book tax difference, plus several other measures that I will show you in a minute. So then we perform a number of diagnostic tests to actually examine whether the treatment and the matched control firms are actually indistinguishable. So our results normally show here that none of the differences in means of each observable characteristic between the treatment and the control firms are actually statistically significant. But as you were mentioning, Bashu, about the dynamics, we have actually done estimation of this equation one of the matched sample over a 3-year period before and after. Actually, we have experimented with 4 years before and after, 5 years for different type of time length we have done. And we have actually arrived at exactly the same conclusion, that the impact of merger actually remain negative on the tax aggressiveness, on different measures of tax aggressiveness at both 1% and 5% level of significance. So of course, we have done a number of placebo tests. Basically,
just to remind you, like we can go on for like 5 more minutes, maybe.
No, 5 minutes. I'll just finish it up.
Yeah.
Okay. So this placebo test is basically done to show that our results are not actually driven by chance. So we actually conduct 2 types of placebo tests. The first one is that we use pseudo event 3 years prior to the actual merger event. So we use the same type of treatment to the and control borrowers identified in the panel. Okay. And so then we also conduct a second placebo test by, it's almost like a kind of RCT kind of thing, by randomly assigning treatment borrowers and control borrowers. So to make sure that the number of pseudo treatment borrowers and pseudo control borrowers is exactly the same number of actual treatment borrowers and control borrowers, which we use actually in our baseline estimation. Then we re-estimate this equation 1 and store coefficients and standard errors for each of the placebo sample. Then we repeat this process approximately 5,000 times to obtain a kind of distribution that can show the distribution of the placebo estimates for each test. And this result is actually presented in this figure over here. So what we find here, the effect of the placebo bank mergers on tax aggressiveness is actually very small and actually insignificant for all tax aggressiveness measures. For example, if we look at the measure for shelter, the graph, so what we find here, the true coefficient on merger is approximately minus 0.102. And so that lies to the left of the entire distribution of the coefficient estimation from the placebo test, which is smaller by about 99.9% of the placebo estimates. So what it implies that approximately 0.1% there is a chance of randomly observing the actual estimates when the null of no bank merger effect is in fact true. Okay, so if we take together all these, what is said, the placebo test shows us that our baseline findings are not actually driven by any randomness or by chance. And of course, they are not affected by any omitted form level fundamental characteristics rather than the bank mergers. So these placebo tests show that. Of course, as you said, that we don't have much time. Then we subject all these baseline estimation. There is a kind of back. Is anybody asking any question or no? No. All right. So then we perform this baseline estimation under a different, subject it to different underlying mechanisms. For instance, bank monitoring, then we have credit availability, and then we do a number of robustness checks with the bank characteristics, and we control for local economic conditions, etc., etc. Just to be brief here, to talk a bit about the bank monitoring condition. As we know that after this, I will just jump straight to the last slide. So bank monitoring, as we know, the financial covenants that I explained in loan contracts, actually, they are based on what we call the hard information, right? And this one actually contain a number of accounting quantities. And preliminary in 2011, they said that those accounting quantities are verifiable actually in court. This covenant-based monitoring, why we're using this bank monitoring here to see whether our results are robust or not, because this type of monitoring actually amplifies banks' incentives to gather information from borrowers, and that actually strengthens and creditor influence of our borrowers' financial and investment policies. Rajan and Winton's paper in 1995, Park's paper 2000, they discuss more on these things. We also think that the impact of bank mergers on borrowers' information disclosure, following a paper by Chen and Bassester in 2017, is more prominent for borrowers with a large number of covenants, right? And we have shown exactly the same type of thing here. We have mergers and we perform the same thing, the positive impact of mergers on performance of covenants, capital covenants, different measures of financial, general covenants, etc., etc. And then we use that type of setting to again re-estimate our model to show what exactly impact the mergers will have on the tax aggression. So we find once again exactly the significant negative impact for different measures of aggressiveness, distinguishing between low bid and high bid ask. Right, so similarly, it continues for several other types of measures, and we also perform robustness of our estimation to different other measures of tax aggressiveness, and then we also control for whether the bank characteristics actually matter and whether it can impact in some way the negative impact of mergers on tax aggressiveness. We have checked for controlling for different bank level characteristics. We found again a robust negative impact everywhere. Does the local economic condition impact? So we control for local condition by actually embedding a number of state level measures to the baseline model. And of course, we also find all in the paper that these local characteristics, if we local state level characteristic we add to the baseline estimation, they do not in any way impact this negative impact of mergers on tax aggression. So right, so finally, coming back to the impact heterogeneity, as pointed by you to some extent, Basu, and one of the referees of the paper, the submission to the Journal of Corporate Finance, that mergers might have differential impact on tax aggressiveness because this mean-based estimation, the results we have obtained, those average impacts can be sensitive because we have found the standard deviation of 2.30 something for the main measure is actually showing that the median and mean, they do not really match. So that is why the OLS-based measures or this panel estimation that we have done in the conventional setting, that might be biased to some extent to represent the differential impact. So we have performed this unconditional quantile estimation, and we have found that the median and the mean effects, the OLS and the median effect, that means that the 50th quantile, the results are not significantly different, but we have found at the higher level quantile, at 75th and 80th quantile, we have found that bank mergers would have a significantly larger negative impact on the tax aggressiveness. But why it is so? Because sometimes it is very hard to identify a theoretical mechanism that why some impacts on average, while they may be negative, while some impacts may be high negative at higher quantile, but low negative, but at lower quantile. So there could not be any kind of theoretical mechanism to explain this one. At least in this case, we do not find anything. We do not know what would explain this way, because merger, in fact, in our case, it's a kind of dummy variable. So a change in the dummy variable, so whether I merge or do not merge. So how this can actually lead to a differential impact? Of course, we have following the referee's comment, we have done that. We have found a large negative impact of the higher quantile, but we have yet to come up with a kind of theoretical explanation that why mergers could have high negative impact at the higher quantile or distribution of tax aggressiveness. We are working on this one. So conclusions. So we find borrowers significantly reduce tax aggressiveness when the lending banks engage in M&H, and that is based on both the OLS-based and the quantile estimates. So although in the quantile estimates we find heterogeneous negative impacts, but on average it's negative impact. So this paper in some contributes to the literature on bank consolidation. So because we find that although there are large number of empirical studies which exist in terms of the impact of mergers on different aspects of, it is not about tax, how the lender's decision-making process change. So there is a limited study on the economic consequence of bank mergers for borrowing firms' accounting practices. But our work is related to the growing body of literature on understanding the real and social effects of financial consolidation. So in a way, our research, I think, contributes to the growing literature on the factors that may influence tax avoidance activities. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I think I will do want to ask one question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Quite a contradictory. I don't know. I think it's more of your opinion. So generally, you have found a positive effect of bank consolidation. Essentially, people are less tax aggressive, trying to avoid taxes less. Companies are. But there is a huge problem with too big to fail phenomenon with banks. Consolidation per se. So from a policymaker's point of view, what, if at all you were to suggest anything, what would you possibly say? Okay, there is this whole lot of monitoring effect which comes in, but at the same time, the risk effects or systemic issues are much larger. So from that context, how would you frame this whole?
Very good. So based on this one, a very nice comment, Bashu. I have developed now a theoretical mechanism to explain this, what we call a mean variance decision theoretic framework, to show what should be an optimal point. For example, that if I avoid or I become aggressive only to that extent, I may not really lose my long-term welfare to a certain extent. So I have done this one, following this empirical exercise. So I have now developed a theoretical mechanism to explain that one. But it is to do it mostly with a long-term value gain. Think about that. Sometimes people say that it's very much related to our real life as well, that aggressive people always enjoy short-term gains, isn't it? But good people, they suffer in the short run, but certainly they gain in the long run. So it is highly correlated to that type of thing. Yes, if you know some nitty-gritties of the tax structure, and if you know you can avoid certain things, yes, they can. But there is an important point here, Vasu, which I should also mention here, that I did not present here, that if I am a kind of socio-economic or political system which can protect to some extent the tax avoidance or tax aggression, bit of corruption, corrupt practices. So in that case, even if I am avoiding tax or becoming aggressive, I can still continue with the system, because it might not, although I know theoretically there will be a reputational damage by engaging in tax aggressiveness, but still I can continue with the tradition because of the corrupt system. So this is one aspect I have not controlled for here. I'm assuming here there is a logical transparency in the system. Yes, in that case, if in an ideal world, it should work like that.
Great, thanks for making this presentation and giving us an insight into how firms behave when like banks merge, and it's a very interesting finding in itself. And from all of us, we are very grateful to have you, and thank you for presenting. We hope that you keep in touch and make more presentations with the Mishra Center, possibly in person as well, whenever you are here.
Yes, thank you very much, Vasu. I had another paper which I sent to Sanket. A recent paper I have, it's a bit of theoretical paper I have done very recently, but hopefully in the future, again, it will be very much related to on the financial market and a lot of economic stuff. It's a theory paper, but next time, if there is an opportunity,
we would love to even host you in person. I think that will be even better to meet
certainly.
you.
This is a kind of subject. Of course, being an economist, I am not a very big expert in finance, but I have started recently working on this corporate finance. Being, I think it said, at least this type of work, it has a lot of psychological and economic implications. And then I try to theorize based on these type of empirical results. I try to theorize something like the mean variance decision model, etc. So it's a pleasure, really an honor, Sanket and Vasu and everybody who are listening to me today. I hope you did not get bored enough. If you have any question, anything, please send me an email. And Sanket, you may like to share the paper that I have sent you. If there are some unanswered questions about the definitions, etc., it's all in the paper. And for example, the different measures of other measures of tax aggressiveness that I have presented, about 10 different measures. Shelter is one of them based on an econometric measure, but there are some other measures. For example, this book tax ratio, adjusted book tax ratio, many other measures. It's all in the paper. That's why I was looking for my paper that where they have put all these exact definitions. But certainly it's all in the paper. So in case you have any doubt, do send me an email.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving such an interesting talk. And what was very impressive was the suite of robustness tests that were done. I mean, it was seriously very impressive in terms of
on this Sanket, let me just allow me to say a couple of things. I will take just 1 minute to say this. People always do a number of robustness exercise, but one thing that we forget, being an econometrician, basically in the finance, what I have seen, there is a difference between doing research in finance and economics. Economists are especially extremely particular about the tests and all the econometric issues they come. But within finance, certainly we do so, but we probably give less importance to the actual econometric underlying mechanism. Whenever we do robustness test, for example, I do robustness test 1, 2, 3, but are we sure all these robustness exercise we are doing, they actually follow exactly the same data generating process? No, normally they are not. And as long as they do not follow the same type of data generating process, then the estimation approaches, the mechanisms are completely different, the narratives are different. But normally people don't care about that, because if I say I am Sanket's friend, Basu is Sanket's friend, so that means I am also Basu's friend. So I am using Basu as one kind of agent or robustness, as an instrument for robustness exercise. But we forget about the thing that Basu has a different type of data generating mechanism. His architecture is different from yours and than mine. So this is why we come up with a lot of problem. But very few empirical studies I'm aware of in finance who are concerned about that. But yes, we have done to satisfy referees and convince people a suite of robustness exercise, sensitivity test, placebo test we have done. But this is, I think, a demand of our time, that once you say something, you need to convince everybody. But how strong this is econometrically meaningful, I have a doubt. But I'm following the convention, but still I'm trying my best to dissociate those type of econometric issues from, and that's the standard notion.
Thank you. Thanks again. And we're really looking forward to having you in person.
Thank you very much, Sanket, Basu, Kapil, Riddhi again. Riddhi, you had to, I think yesterday you spoke to me, and I'm sure you are not. Yeah.
It's all the participants who are there. I think they have been listening to you throughout. I think they've been present all through. So I guess with this, we should conclude this whole talk. And again, final thanks to Professor Mishra and all the participants and the organizers.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. You all have a nice evening.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We can stop the recording.